Chapter 31, Section 2, Post-War Politics, Readjustments and Challenges. Harry Truman had never wanted to be president. The day after he learned of Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, he told reporters, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Harry Truman, 1945. Truman's first task was to bring the war to an end. Once that was done, he faced the enormous challenge of leading the country back to a peacetime economy. A rocky transition to peace. Truman welcomed the war's end by announcing a package of reforms that later came to be known as the Fair Deal. He called on Congress to increase the minimum wage, increase aid to agriculture and education, and enact a national health insurance program. Complaining that Truman was out-New Dealing the New Deal, Republicans in Congress did their best to stall his reforms. Meanwhile, the economy was going through a difficult period of adjustment. As the war came to a close, government officials canceled billions of dollars worth of war contracts. As a result, millions of defense workers lost their jobs. In addition, once wartime price controls were lifted, prices skyrocketed. As inflation soared, workers demanded wage increases. When employers refused to meet these demands, labor unions triggered the largest strike wave in U.S. history. In 1946, nearly 5 million workers walked off the job, many of them in such key industries as steel production, coal mining, and oil refining. When railroad workers went on strike, Truman took action. In a speech to Congress, he warned, "Food, raw materials, fuel, shipping, housing, the public health, the public safety, all will be dangerously affected if the strike were allowed to continue." Truman threatened to call out the armed forces to run the railroads. However, the strike was settled before he could carry out his threat. Truman battles a Republican Congress. The labor unrest was still fresh in voters' minds as the 1946 congressional elections drew near. Running under the slogan, "Had enough?" Republican candidates swept to victory. For the first time since the 1920s, Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress. One of the first actions of the new Republican Congress was the passage of the 22nd Amendment in 1947. This amendment limits a president to 2 terms of office. The Republican sponsors of the amendment did not want to see another liberal president like Franklin Roosevelt seek 4 terms as president. They argued that without term limits, a popular president might seek to become president for life, much like a dictator. The amendment was overwhelmingly ratified by the states and was added to the Constitution in 1951. Congress also took aim at the labor unions by passing the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. This law placed many limits on the power of unions. Among other things, it outlawed the closed shop. A closed shop is a workplace in which the employer agrees to hire only members of a particular union. It bans sympathy strikes, in which workers of one union walk off their jobs to show their sympathy with another striking union. It also allowed the president to impose an 80-day cooling-off period before a union could strike in certain industries. This provision especially enraged union supporters, who called it slave labor law. President Truman vetoed the law, but Congress passed it over his veto. Truman also battled with Congress over civil rights. Late in 1946, he established the President Committee on Civil Rights to investigate racial inequality in the United States. The committee issued a report calling for an end to segregation and discrimination in voting, housing, education, employment, and the military. Truman praised the report as an American Charter of Human Freedom. Congress, however, refused to act on its recommendations. In 1948, Truman sidestepped Congress and desegregated the armed forces by executive order. An upset victory in 1948. As the election of 1948 drew near, Democrats were filled with gloom. Truman, who had been unable to get any of his reforms passed by the Republican Congress, looked like a weak candidate. Worse yet, the Democratic Party had splintered into 3 factions. Left-wing Democrats, led by former Vice President Henry Wallace, pulled away to form the Progressive Party. Wallace was more liberal than Truman on domestic issues, but his main difference with the president was over foreign policy. Fearing that Truman's hard-line containment policy would lead to World War III, he advocated friendlier relations with the Soviet Union. Segregationist Southern Democrats, known as Dixiecrats, left to form the state's Rights Democratic Party. The Dixiecrats nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, for the presidency. Thurman ran on a platform of complete segregation of the races. The Republicans nominated New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey to run against Truman. Dewey was heavily favored to win, despite his lackluster campaign style. One newspaper ran this parody of the typical bland Dewey speech. "Agriculture is important. Our rivers are full of fish. You cannot have freedom without liberty. Our future lies ahead." Truman decided to fight for the presidency. He launched an ambitious whistle-stop tour of the country. A whistle-stop is a small town where a train would stop only if signaled to do so by a whistle. During his tour, Truman made 356 stops to speak directly to voters. At every one, he lambasted the do-nothing Republican Congress. His supporters cheered him on with the slogan, "Give him hell, Harry." On election eve, opinion polls predicted a Dewey landslide. Only Truman seemed to believe he could win. The voters proved Truman right. In one of the biggest electoral upsets in history, Truman narrowly won re-election. For the next 4 years, Truman regularly presented his Fair Deal programs to Congress. However, a coalition of conservative Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans blocked most of his reform efforts. Congress did agree to a modest expansion of Social Security benefits. It also agreed to increase the minimum wage and support slum clearance. Ike takes the middle of the road. During the 1952 election season, the Democratic Party came together again around Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. Stevenson was much admired for his elegant speaking style and wit. The Republicans nominated the immensely popular war hero, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had an impressive biography. After serving as Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, he had gone on to become head of NATO. Moreover, people loved Eisenhower's winning smile and agreeable manner. Building on his nickname, Ike, the Republican campaign featured posters and buttons saying, "I like Ike." Richard Nixon, a young senator from California, was chosen to be Eisenhower's running mate. A strong anti-communist, Nixon had gained prominence as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. In the election, Eisenhower swept to victory in 39 of the 48 states. 4 years later, he again defeated Stevenson to win a second term as president. During his presidency, Eisenhower embraced a program he described as modern republicanism. He promised to be conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. He resisted calls by conservatives to roll back the New Deal. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, he warned, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. Eisenhower went further and expanded Social Security. By doing so, he ensured that his popular New Deal programs controlled the White House. At the same time, Eisenhower presided over a massive peacetime arms buildup. Our arms, he stated, must be mighty, ready for instant action. Still, he worried about the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex. In his last address as president, Eisenhower warned, "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." Dwight D. Eisenhower, Farewell Address, 1961.